The gala was like any other event Michael Harrington attended, drenched in opulence, lined with polished smiles, and brimming with the aroma of expensive champagne. The son of an oil tycoon, Michael had grown accustomed to the grandiosity of his world, but it often felt like a hollow stage. That night, as he idly circled the room, the glittering chandelier above catching every facet of his tailored suit, his gaze fell on her. She was seated near the piano, a serene smile adorning her delicate face. Her chestnut hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing her ethereal beauty. Unlike the crowd, who seemed preoccupied with flaunting wealth, she exuded a quiet grace. Michael was instantly captivated. He crossed the room, his interest sparked like never before. As he approached, he noticed her hands delicately tracing the stem of her wine glass, her fingers dancing over it as if deciphering its texture. Her movements, so precise and deliberate, intrigued him. "Beautiful music," he said, motioning toward the pianist, though his eyes were fixed on her. She turned her head toward his voice, her sightless gaze startling him. Her eyes, hazel and luminous, were unfocused, and suddenly he understood. She was blind. "Yes," she replied softly, her voice like a melody. "It's Rachmaninoff. My father used to play it for me when I was little. It's comforting." Michael swallowed, his carefully rehearsed charm faltering. "I'm Michael. May I sit?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I'm Clara." Their conversation flowed effortlessly, but Michael was struck by how little Clara seemed fazed by his world of wealth and status. Instead, she spoke of the music, the tactile joy of sculpting clay, and the poetry she loved to hear. She described sunsets from memory, their colors recited from stories others had shared. It was as though she saw the world in a way he never could, despite her blindness. For the first time in years, Michael felt seen, not for his money, his power, or his name, but as a person. By the end of the evening, he was no longer just captivated by Clara's beauty, he was drawn to her strength, her vivid inner world, and the way she lived without bitterness. As the gala wound down, Michael couldn't bear the thought of this being their only meeting. "Clara," he began, his voice earnest, "would you let me take you out? To hear more music, or anything you enjoy?" She smiled, a small, bittersweet curve of her lips. "I'm not sure what someone like you would find with someone like me." Michael frowned. "What does that mean?" "You're from a different world, Michael. I don't see how our lives could fit together." But Michael, who had spent his life winning in business and outmaneuvering competitors, now faced a challenge he couldn't walk away from. "Let me try," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Just one evening. If it doesn't work, I'll leave you alone." Clara hesitated, but something in his tone, genuine, vulnerable, made her agree. "All right," she said. "One evening." As Michael watched her leave, escorted by a companion who gently guided her toward the exit, he felt something he hadn't in years, a purpose that extended beyond himself. But as he vowed to learn more about her world, a single thought took root in his mind: he would do everything to help her see again. He had no idea that this determination would set them on a path of love, frustration, and ultimately, self-discovery. The following week, Michael found himself more nervous than he'd been during high-stakes business negotiations. He stood outside Clara's modest brownstone, a single violet orchid in hand, a flower he'd learned symbolized admiration and strength. It seemed fitting. When Clara opened the door, she was dressed simply but elegantly, her chestnut hair loosely tied back. Her friend, who Michael recognized as the companion from the gala, smiled politely and whispered something to Clara before stepping aside. "Michael," Clara greeted, tilting her head slightly, as if sensing his presence more than seeing it. "You're punctual." "I figured being late on our first outing wouldn't make the best impression," he said, a lopsided grin betraying his nerves. He extended the flower toward her, then hesitated. This is for you." "It's an orchid." Clara's hand reached out, brushing his fingers as she found the stem. She smiled, her fingers tracing the petals delicately. "Thank you. Orchids are intricate. Beautiful." He felt a surge of relief, though the evening was far from over. "Shall we?" Michael had planned their outing with precision. He took her to a small, family-run restaurant that boasted live music, a string quartet playing classical favorites. He'd called ahead, ensuring the atmosphere was intimate and the noise level suitable for conversation. As they were seated, Clara asked, "So, Michael, what's a man like you doing with a woman like me?" Her directness caught him off guard. He leaned back in his chair, studying her serene expression. "What do you mean, a woman like you?" "I mean," Clara said, tilting her head, "that men who roll up in luxury cars and probably own more suits than I have dresses don't usually, well, notice women like me." Michael leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Maybe those men don't know what they're missing." She smiled faintly, but there was a flicker of disbelief in her expression. Michael realized he'd have to do more than charm her, he'd have to show her that his intentions were genuine. Their conversation that evening ranged from Clara's love of sculpture, something she'd discovered by accident during a community art class, to Michael's upbringing in a world of privilege. For the first time, he admitted how empty it often felt, how success hadn't filled the void in his life. "I think," Clara said, after a pause, "that you're looking for something money can't buy. Maybe that's why you noticed me." Michael opened his mouth to respond but found himself momentarily at a loss. She wasn't wrong, though he wasn't sure he was ready to admit it. The string quartet began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune, and Clara tilted her head toward the sound, her expression softening. "This was my mother's favorite piece," she said. "She used to hum it while cooking. I can still hear her sometimes." Michael watched her as the music played, entranced by the way she seemed to feel it with her entire being. He wanted, more than anything, to give her the world she deserved. And as that thought solidified, so did his resolve. As he walked her back to her door later that evening, Michael hesitated. "Clara," he began, his voice uncertain. "Would you ever consider seeking treatment for your blindness? I mean, if there was a way to restore your sight." Clara stiffened slightly. "Michael, I've been blind since I was a child. I've made peace with it." "Why do you ask?" He hesitated. "Because I'd like to help. If there's even the slightest chance." Clara interrupted gently. "Michael, I appreciate the thought. But I'm not broken. I don't need fixing." Her words hit him harder than he expected, but he nodded, not wanting to push. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that." She smiled softly, reaching out to touch his arm. "I know. But I'm fine as I am." As she disappeared inside, Michael stood on the steps, her words echoing in his mind. Yet, as much as he respected her acceptance, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more he could do. For Clara, the idea of seeing the world again might seem impossible. But for Michael, impossibility was just another obstacle to overcome. What he didn't yet realize was how much that determination would challenge everything between them. Over the next few weeks, Michael and Clara fell into a steady rhythm of shared moments. He took her to concerts, gardens where she could touch and smell every bloom, and even a pottery studio where she expertly sculpted a vase while teasing him about his lopsided attempts. For Clara, it felt like she was finally opening a new chapter of her life. Michael's world was foreign to her, filled with extravagance and privilege, but he was always attentive, never letting her feel out of place. He described sunsets in painstaking detail and indulged her love for music by arranging intimate performances with local musicians. But in the quiet moments, when Clara rested her head on his shoulder or laughed at his awkward attempts to impress her, Michael's thoughts drifted to the one thing he hadn't shared with her, his relentless pursuit of a way to restore her sight. One rainy afternoon, Michael found himself sitting across from a leading ophthalmologist, a man whose reputation for tackling impossible cases preceded him. Michael had spent weeks researching, consulting experts from across the globe, and his search had led him here. "Mr. Harrington," the doctor began, adjusting his glasses, "it's an admirable thing you're trying to do. But without examining the patient, I can't make any promises." "I understand," Michael said, leaning forward. "But hypothetically, if Clara's condition, retinal scarring, was reversible, is there a chance? Even a small one?" The doctor hesitated. There are experimental treatments being developed. Stem cell therapy, gene editing. They're cutting edge, but with a patient like Clara, we'd need to proceed cautiously. The emotional toll alone can be significant. Michael's heart raced. A chance was better than none. I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what the next step is. The doctor nodded. I'll need to meet Clara, run tests, and explain the risks to her myself. She needs to be on board for this. As Michael left the office, the doctor's words echoed in his mind, she needs to be on board. But how could he convince Clara to take this leap when she seemed so at peace with her world as it was? That evening, Michael and Clara sat in his garden, the air fragrant with jasmine. Clara tilted her face toward the warm glow of the outdoor lamps, her hands resting on the arm of her chair. She seemed content, and Michael struggled to find the right words. Clara, he began cautiously, I've been thinking about something. She turned her head toward him, a curious smile playing on her lips. That sounds serious. It's about your eyesight, he said, bracing himself. I met with a doctor today, a specialist. He thinks there's a chance, a small one, that your sight could be restored. Clara's expression shifted, her brows knitting together. Michael. Before you say anything, he interrupted gently, just hear me out. This doctor works with cutting-edge treatments, stem cells, gene therapy. It's not guaranteed, but it's worth exploring. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I've been through this before. Doctors with promises, experimental therapies. I've made peace with my blindness. I don't need to see to have a full life. Michael reached for her hand, his grip firm but tender. I know that, Clara. I admire your strength. But wouldn't you want to see the world just once? To experience colors, sunsets, the way I look at you? Clara's breath caught, and for a moment, silence hung between them. When she spoke, her voice was soft but resolute. Michael, I'm not afraid of being blind. What I'm afraid of is hoping for something that might never come. I don't want to live in a cycle of disappointment. Michael's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to tell her that hope was worth the risk. But he saw the exhaustion behind her words, the quiet resignation of someone who had faced this battle before. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to hurt you. I want to give you everything. Clara smiled faintly, squeezing his hand. You already do. But I need you to see me as I am, Michael. Not as someone who needs fixing. Michael nodded, but deep down, he wasn't ready to let go of the idea. For him, this wasn't just about restoring her sight, it was about giving her everything he thought she deserved. He just didn't realize that his determination would soon test the very foundation of their relationship. Michael's world became consumed by research, consultations, and planning. Every free moment was spent poring over medical journals or exchanging emails with specialists, seeking any glimmer of hope. But his devotion to Clara's potential treatment began to pull him away from the simplicity of what they'd built together. Meanwhile, Clara sensed a shift. Their outings grew less frequent, their conversations increasingly dominated by Michael's updates on experimental procedures. She listened patiently, her soft nods masking a growing frustration she couldn't yet articulate. One evening, Clara decided to speak up. Michael had invited her to his penthouse, promising a quiet dinner. But as soon as they sat down, he launched into an enthusiastic description of a cutting-edge clinic in Switzerland. They're doing amazing things, Clara, he said, his eyes alight with excitement. The doctors there have had success with cases just like yours. Clara placed her fork down gently, her appetite waning. Michael, we've been over this. I know, he said quickly, leaning forward. But this is different. They've treated patients who... Michael, Clara interrupted, her tone firmer this time. I don't want to go to Switzerland. Or Germany. Or anywhere else you've researched. I thought I made that clear. Her words caught him off guard. But Clara, this could be life-changing. It's worth a try. She shook her head, her expression softening. For who, Michael? For you or for me? Her question hung in the air, heavy and raw. Michael opened his mouth to respond but found no words. Clara continued, her voice quieter now. I love the life we're building together. I love the way you describe sunsets and how you play music for me when I can't sleep. I don't need to see to appreciate any of that. Michael reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her voice trembling. You're so focused on changing me that you're not even here anymore. Every time we're together, all you talk about is the next doctor or the next treatment. Do you even see me, Michael? Her words hit him like a blow to the chest. Of course I see you, he said, his voice unsteady. That's why I'm doing this, because I love you. I want to give you the world. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line as she stood, pushing her chair back. Maybe the world you're trying to give me isn't the one I want. Michael watched helplessly as she walked toward the door, her movements purposeful yet heavy with emotion. Clara, wait, he called after her. She paused, her hand on the doorknob. Michael, I care about you. But I can't keep doing this. I can't be your project. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving Michael alone with the weight of her words and the echo of the door closing behind her. In the days that followed, Michael threw himself deeper into his work, trying to numb the ache in his chest. He told himself Clara would come around, that she'd understand he only wanted the best for her. But as the weeks turned into months, he began to realize that perhaps Clara had been right. He had been so focused on fixing what he saw as broken that he'd failed to appreciate the beautiful, whole person she already was. And now, the absence of her voice, her laughter, her presence, it was unbearable. Months later, as the winter snow began to melt into spring, Michael found himself sitting in the very garden where he and Clara had once talked about music and life. The jasmine vines had been pruned back, but their scent lingered faintly in the cool air. For the first time in his life, Michael felt powerless. All the money, all the connections, and all the resources in the world couldn't bring back what he had lost. Yet, even in the quiet despair of his solitude, a flicker of hope remained. Clara had left, but she hadn't said goodbye forever. And Michael vowed that if he ever got the chance to see her again, he would love her as she was, without conditions, without expectations. But for now, all he could do was wait. The door closed behind Clara with a soft click, but the sound echoed like a gunshot in Michael's ears. He stood frozen in place, replaying her words over and over, I can't be your project. For days, Michael tried to reach her, leaving messages she didn't return. He sent flowers that came back unopened. The realization of how deeply he had hurt her clawed at his chest, a pain sharper than he thought possible. She was right, he had been so fixated on fixing her that he'd lost sight of who she really was. Months passed, and Michael buried himself in work. Nights were restless, days were a blur. In his quieter moments, he found himself revisiting the places they'd shared, like the pottery studio where she'd teased him for his misshapen vase. He replayed her laughter in his mind, aching for the simplicity of those days. But life moved forward, even when he didn't want it to. One rainy afternoon, as he sat in the same garden where they had once dreamed together, his phone buzzed. The message was short but sent his heart racing. Michael, can we talk? Clara arrived at the cafe wearing her usual calm expression, but her posture was hesitant. Michael stood as she approached, his nerves threatening to undo him. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said, his voice unsteady. I almost didn't, she admitted. But I realized there are things we need to say to each other. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words thick between them. Finally, Clara broke it. Michael, I want you to know that I never stopped caring about you. But the way things were, it wasn't healthy for either of us. I know, Michael said quickly, leaning forward. You were right, Clara. I wasn't listening to you. I was so determined to give you what I thought you needed that I forgot to just be with you. Clara tilted her head, considering his words. Why did you want it so badly? She asked softly. Michael exhaled slowly. Because I wanted you to have everything. Because I was scared that if I didn't try to fix it, I'd lose you. And now, his voice broke slightly. Now I know I almost did. Clara's expression softened. Michael, I don't need you to fix me. I've been blind most of my life. I've made peace with it. What I need is for you to accept me as I am. I do, Michael said, his voice earnest. I swear, Clara. But, if there's even the smallest chance you'd consider one last consultation, I'd only ask for that because I know you'd make the decision that's right for you. Clara hesitated. Her instinct was to reject the idea outright, but the vulnerability in Michael's voice gave her pause. She saw that he wasn't demanding this of her anymore. He was asking, not for himself, but to let her choose. Finally, she nodded. One consultation. But you have to promise me, Michael, if it doesn't work or if I decide not to pursue it, we let it go. His breath hitched as he nodded. I promise. The day of the procedure came sooner than expected. Clara, nervous but resolute, held Michael's hand as the anesthetic began to take effect. He whispered reassurances, though his own heart pounded in his chest. When she woke hours later, the bandages were thick over her eyes, and the room felt too quiet. Michael sat beside her, gripping her hand tightly. The surgery went as planned, Dr. Aldridge said, his tone cautious. But we won't know for a few days if the results will last. Michael thanked him, but his attention remained on Clara. I'm here, he murmured. No matter what happens. Clara squeezed his hand, but said nothing. The days of waiting stretched endlessly, her anticipation mingling with fear. Michael stayed with her, his presence steady and grounding. On the fourth day, the bandages were removed. Clara's breath hitched as light pierced through her eyelids for the first time in decades. She opened her eyes tentatively, her vision a haze of colors and shadows. And then she saw him. Michael's face came into focus, and she gasped softly. It's you, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're real. Tears welled in Michael's eyes as he smiled. You can see me? Clara nodded, her own tears spilling over. You're everything I imagined, she said, her hands trembling as she reached to touch his face. But so much more. Michael leaned into her touch, his heart swelling with an indescribable mix of joy and relief. Clara, he whispered, his voice breaking. You're beautiful. She laughed through her tears, her voice light and musical. So are you. In that moment, everything else faded. There were no fears, no uncertainties, just the two of them, seeing each other fully for the first time. The days that followed were a revelation for Clara. Michael watched with awe as she explored the world she had only known through touch and sound. She marveled at the vibrant colors of flowers she had once smelled but never seen. She laughed as she stood before the ocean, her eyes widening at the expanse of blue that seemed to stretch forever. She clung to Michael's arm as they wandered through bustling city streets, her gaze darting between neon lights and towering skyscrapers. Michael felt like he was seeing the world anew through her eyes. Her wonder was contagious, and he found himself noticing details he'd long taken for granted. Clara's joy became his, and he cherished every moment. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking a glowing cityscape, Clara turned to him, her expression wistful. It's all so much, she said. I never thought I'd see any of this. Michael smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You deserve to see everything, Clara. She leaned against him, her voice soft. Thank you. For never giving up on me. But even as they shared those moments of joy, the shadow of uncertainty lingered. The doctor's warnings echoed in Michael's mind, a quiet reminder that their miracle might be fleeting. And then, one morning, Clara woke to find the edges of her vision fading, like a light dimming too soon. Clara's hands trembled as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the blurred shapes of her surroundings. The once vivid colors of the curtains, the sunlight streaming through the windows, all of it was now veiled in a hazy gray. Her heart raced as she blinked furiously, hoping to clear her vision, but the fog remained. Michael entered the room moments later, carrying their usual morning coffee. He froze when he saw her expression, the look of fear and resignation in her eyes. "Clara," he said softly, setting the mugs down and rushing to her side. "What's wrong?" She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's fading, Michael. I can barely see." The air felt heavy, his breath catching in his throat. He knelt before her, his hands resting gently on hers. "Maybe it's temporary," he said quickly, his voice laced with both hope and denial. "We'll call Dr. Aldridge. He'll know what to do." Clara shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "Michael, we knew this might happen. I thought I was prepared, but—" Her words broke off into a sob, and Michael pulled her into his arms. "We'll figure it out," he murmured, though his own voice trembled. "We'll try again." The days that followed were filled with desperation. Clara's vision continued to deteriorate until the darkness became absolute once more. Michael insisted on consulting Dr. Aldridge, who confirmed what they had both feared: the experimental treatment had failed, and her blindness was irreversible. "I'm deeply sorry, Clara," the doctor said. "We pushed the boundaries, but the damage to your optic nerves is beyond what current science can repair." Clara nodded quietly, her expression unreadable. Michael, however, clenched his fists. "There has to be something else," he said, his tone verging on a plea. "Another doctor, another treatment, anything." Dr. Aldridge sighed. "I wish there were, Mr. Harrington. But sometimes, the hardest truth is accepting the limits of what we can do." Back at Michael's penthouse, Clara sat silently in the living room, running her fingers over the edge of a cushion. Michael paced behind her, his mind racing with possibilities. He couldn't bear to see her like this, withdrawn, her spirit dimmed. "Clara," he began hesitantly, sitting beside her. "I know this feels hopeless right now, but we can keep looking. There are other specialists, other trials." She turned toward him, her unseeing eyes somehow piercing. "Michael, stop." He froze, his mouth half open, stunned by the quiet finality in her voice. "I'm done chasing miracles," Clara said, her tone firm. "I thought I could handle it if this didn't work, but getting my sight back, even for a little while, it was cruel. Like the universe wanted to remind me of everything I'll never have." Her voice broke slightly, but she steadied herself. "I can't go through this again. I won't." Michael's chest tightened. "Clara, I just want to help. I can't stand to see you hurting." "I know," she said, reaching out to touch his face, her fingers tracing his jaw. "And I love you for it. But Michael, you have to let this go. I've accepted my blindness. Can you?" He didn't answer immediately, the question twisting like a knife in his chest. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw. "I just want you to have the life you deserve." Clara smiled faintly. "The life I deserve isn't about what I can or can't see. It's about being at peace with myself, and with the people I love." That night, they lay in bed side by side, the silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. Michael stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment they had shared. He thought of her laughter, her strength, her ability to find beauty in the world even without sight. And he realized that maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't about what he thought she needed, but about simply being there for her. "I'll try," he whispered finally, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I'll try to let go." Clara squeezed his hand, her voice soft but firm. "That's all I need." Clara sat in the psychologist's office, the smell of lavender and the faint sound of a ticking clock filling the room. The soft hum of the psychologist's voice grounded her as she recounted the whirlwind of emotions that had overtaken her life since meeting Michael. "He's the most caring man I've ever known," Clara said, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "But it's like he can't just be with me. He has to fix me." The psychologist, Dr. Evelyn Marks, nodded thoughtfully. Her demeanor was calm, her eyes kind and attentive. "And how does that make you feel, Clara?" Clara exhaled shakily. "Conflicted. On one hand, I know he loves me, and I believe he genuinely wants the best for me. But on the other, it's exhausting. Every treatment, every consultation, it's like he's trying to force me into a version of myself that I don't even recognize anymore. Dr. Marks leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle. You feel like you're losing control of your own narrative. Yes, Clara said quickly, her voice rising with emotion. I've spent years accepting who I am. Blindness isn't something I asked for, but I've made peace with it. And then he came into my life, and it's like he reopened wounds I'd already healed. Dr. Marks was quiet for a moment, letting Clara's words settle. And yet, you care deeply for him. Clara nodded, her voice softer now. I do. I've never felt this way about anyone before. But I'm afraid if I don't go along with him, if I don't at least try these treatments, he'll never be happy. He'll never see me as enough. Dr. Marks regarded her carefully. Let me ask you this, Clara. Do you think his love for you is conditional? That it depends on whether or not you can see? Clara froze, the question hanging in the air. No, she said finally, though her voice wavered. He loves me. I know that. But I think he sees my blindness as a problem to solve. And if he can't solve it, I don't know if he'll be able to stay. Dr. Marks gave a small nod, jotting something in her notebook. And what about you, Clara? What do you want? Not for him, but for yourself. Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around the hem of her sweater. I want peace, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I want to feel like I can just be myself, without having to constantly fight to prove that I'm enough as I am. Dr. Marks smiled gently. That's a very honest and powerful answer. Clara, it's clear that you and Michael share something special, but relationships require balance. If one partner is always trying to change the other, even with good intentions, it can create resentment. The real question is whether you believe Michael can accept you as you are, not just love you, but truly accept you. Clara looked down, her thoughts spinning. And if he can't? Then you have a choice to make, Dr. Marks said. You can continue down this path, trying to meet his expectations, even if it conflicts with your own peace of mind. Or you can set boundaries, clear, compassionate ones, and give him the chance to meet you where you are. If he truly loves you, Clara, he will learn to let go of his need to fix and instead focus on simply being with you. Clara felt tears well in her eyes. It's just so hard. I don't want to lose him. I know, Dr. Marks said gently. But you deserve to feel whole in this relationship, not like a project or a problem to be solved. Take some time to reflect. Think about what brings you joy, what makes you feel at peace. And when you're ready, have an honest conversation with Michael. Be clear about what you need from him moving forward. Clara nodded, her heart heavy, but her mind a little clearer. Thank you, Dr. Marks. As she left the office, Clara felt a flicker of clarity. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain, she couldn't continue as things were. She loved Michael deeply, but she needed to love herself enough to ask for what she deserved, acceptance, peace, and the freedom to simply be. Clara returned home after her session with Dr. Marks feeling drained yet determined. The psychologist's words had given her clarity, but they also underscored the weight of what lay ahead. She needed to talk to Michael, really talk, without sidestepping her needs or minimizing her feelings. That evening, she invited him to her apartment. When Michael arrived, she could sense his eagerness to make things right, the unspoken hope in the way he kissed her cheek and took her hand. I missed you, he said softly, his voice tinged with longing. I missed you too, Clara replied, leading him to the couch. They sat side by side, the silence between them heavy, but not uncomfortable. Michael, she began, turning slightly toward him, there's something I need to say, and I need you to listen. His expression grew serious, his hands clasping hers tightly. I'm listening. She took a deep breath. I saw a psychologist today. I needed help figuring out what to do, about us, about everything. Michael's brows furrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Clara continued. I love you, Michael. I've never doubted that. But these past months have been so hard. It feels like you're always searching for a way to fix me, to make me into someone else. And it's exhausting. His grip on her hands tightened. Clara, Please, she interrupted gently. Let me finish. Michael nodded, his throat tightening. I know your heart is in the right place. You want the best for me. But Michael, I've spent years coming to terms with my blindness. It's a part of who I am, and I built a life I'm proud of. I don't want to keep chasing treatments or surgeries that might never work. I need to live my life without feeling like I'm broken or incomplete. Michael's voice trembled as he spoke. You're not broken, Clara. I never meant to make you feel that way. He paused, his hands falling to his lap. I just wanted to give you everything. And I love you for that, Clara said, her voice softening. But Michael, what I need isn't a cure. I need to know that you can love me as I am, not as someone you hope I'll become. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken fears. Michael stared at the floor, his thoughts racing. Finally, he looked up, his eyes glistening. You're right, he admitted, his voice raw. I've been so focused on what I thought you needed that I didn't stop to ask what you actually wanted. I never wanted to hurt you, Clara. He trailed off, his voice breaking. She reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. I know you didn't mean to hurt me. And I don't want to lose you. But I can't go on like this. If we're going to have a future together, I need you to let go of this idea of fixing me. Can you do that? Michael hesitated, the question cutting through him. Could he truly let go? Could he stop searching for answers and simply be content with Clara as she was? Finally, he nodded, though his voice wavered. I'll try. I promise, Clara, I'll try. Over the next few weeks, Michael worked to prove his promise wasn't just words. He canceled the consultations and stopped discussing potential treatments. Instead, he focused on being present with Clara, appreciating her world on her terms. They returned to the pottery studio where they had first laughed together, their hands covered in clay. They visited the botanical gardens, where Clara ran her fingers over the leaves and inhaled the sweet scents of flowers. Michael described the colors of the sunset to her with a poetic flair, and Clara teased him for his dramatic metaphors. For the first time in months, they felt like themselves again. The weight of expectations lifted, replaced by the simple joy of being together. But even as their bond strengthened, Clara knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Michael's determination to help her had been a cornerstone of their relationship, and she wondered if he could truly set that aside. Dr. Marks's words echoed in her mind, if he truly loves you, he will learn to let go of his need to fix and instead focus on simply being with you. Clara hoped with all her heart that Michael could rise to the challenge. Only time would tell if their love was strong enough to weather the changes still to come. Weeks passed, and Clara began to feel the shift in her relationship with Michael. He was more present, more attuned to her needs, without trying to impose solutions. Their conversations were lighter, filled with laughter and the kind of connection they had shared when they first met. Still, a lingering doubt tugged at her heart, could this change truly last? One crisp autumn morning, Michael surprised Clara with a visit to a secluded park she'd once mentioned loving as a child. It's a place I used to visit with my parents, Clara had told him. I don't remember what it looked like, but I remember the sound of the leaves rustling and the scent of the lake. Michael had gone out of his way to recreate that memory. He described the park to her as they walked along the trail, pointing out the vibrant reds and golds of the trees, the gentle slope of the path toward the water, and the sunlight filtering through the branches. As they sat on a wooden bench by the lake, Clara took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs. This is exactly how I remember it, she said with a small smile. I wanted you to experience it again, Michael replied. On your terms, not mine. Clara turned toward him, her fingers brushing his. You've been different lately. Quieter, calmer. I think I like this version of you. Michael chuckled softly, though his expression was serious. It's not easy, you know. Letting go of the need to fix everything. It's in my nature to solve problems. I'm not a problem, Michael, Clara said gently. I know, he said, his voice soft but firm. And I'm learning. I want you to know I see you, Clara. Not as someone who needs to change, but as the incredible person you already are. Her heart swelled at his words, but she remained cautious. I believe you mean that, she said. But what happens if that urge comes back? If you see another chance, another doctor, another possibility? Michael hesitated, the weight of her question clear. Then I'll remind myself of this moment, he said finally, gesturing to the park around them. Of how happy we are right now, without chasing anything. Clara smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. That's all I need, Michael. Just you, as you are. Over the following weeks, Clara's trust in Michael began to rebuild. They settled into a rhythm of simple joys, cooking together, attending live music performances, and taking walks through the city. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt a sense of peace. But peace can be fragile, and life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. One evening, while Clara was brushing her fingers over a new sculpture she was creating, Michael's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it and froze. It was an email from a renowned eye specialist he had contacted months earlier, offering a new consultation for Clara's case. Michael's pulse quickened. The words on the screen were tempting, the promise of a possible breakthrough dangling in front of him. He closed the email, but the idea planted itself in his mind like a seed. Everything okay? Clara asked, sensing his shift in mood. Michael hesitated before replying, Yeah, it's nothing. But the hesitation wasn't lost on Clara. She set down her clay tools and turned toward him. Michael, if there's something on your mind, just tell me. He looked at her, torn between his desire to be honest and his fear of reopening old wounds. Finally, he sighed. I got an email. From a doctor who says there's a new treatment. It's probably nothing, but... Clara's face fell, and Michael immediately regretted saying anything. I thought we agreed to let this go, she said quietly. We did, Michael said quickly. And I wasn't planning to follow up, I swear. I didn't want to hide it from you. Clara nodded slowly, her emotions churning. Thank you for telling me, she said. But Michael, this is exactly what I was afraid of. That part of you will always be chasing something I don't need. I'm not chasing it, Michael said, his voice pleading. He paused, running a hand through his hair. I just want to make sure I don't let a real chance slip away. For you. Clara sighed, her shoulders slumping. I can't keep doing this, Michael. I need you to decide, can you truly let this go? Or are you always going to be looking for the next possibility? Her words cut him deeply, but Michael knew she was right. The moment of truth had come, and he had to make a choice, not just for Clara, but for their future together. As she waited for his answer, Michael reached for her hands, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I love you, Clara. And if letting go of this means keeping you in my life, then that's what I'll do. No more doctors. No more treatments. Just us. Clara searched his face, her unseeing eyes seeming to pierce through him. Finally, she nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Then let's move forward. Together. Michael pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly as relief and resolve coursed through him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt certain of his path. All that mattered was the woman in his arms, and the love they shared. The rest, he decided, could finally be left behind. In the weeks following their heartfelt conversation, Michael threw himself into a new way of loving Clara, a way that didn't involve doctors, treatments, or searching for answers. Instead, he focused on what she had taught him, appreciating life as it was, not as he thought it should be. For Clara, this shift wasn't immediate. She remained cautious, watching for signs of the old Michael, the fixer, the problem solver. But as days turned into weeks, she saw his efforts to simply be present, to enjoy their time together without pushing her toward a solution she didn't want. One crisp winter morning, Michael surprised Clara with tickets to a music retreat in Vermont. "It's intimate," he explained as they boarded the train. "Small performances, just a handful of musicians, and the kind of atmosphere I think you'll love." Clara smiled, her fingers resting on his arm. "You've gotten good at this whole understanding me thing." "I've had a great teacher," he replied, kissing her hand. The retreat was everything Clara needed. Set in a cozy and surrounded by snow-covered woods, it was a haven of warmth and music. Each evening, musicians played violin and cello by the fireplace, their melodies weaving stories of love and longing. Clara leaned into Michael's side as the notes swirled around them, her face serene. "Do you ever miss it?" Michael asked one night, his voice soft. "Miss what?" Clara replied, her head resting on his shoulder. "Sight," he said, hesitating. "I mean, after everything." Clara was quiet for a moment, then tilted her head toward him. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But not the way you'd think. I don't miss what I've never truly known. I miss the things I had for a little while. Like your face." Michael's chest tightened. "I wish you could see me now," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Because every time I look at you, you're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Clara smiled, her fingers finding his. "I don't need my eyes for that, Michael. I feel it every time you touch me, every time you hold me. That's enough." As their relationship deepened, Clara began to notice a change in herself. The brief period of having her sight, though fleeting, had left an imprint on her heart, a bittersweet longing for things she'd only glimpsed. One night, as they sat in their apartment listening to a violinist play over the stereo, Clara spoke up. "Michael?" "Yes," he replied, turning toward her. "Do you think I could ever paint?" He frowned slightly, confused. "Of course you could. But, how?" She smiled, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about the colors I saw during those weeks I could see. The golden leaves, the blue sky, your eyes. I don't want to lose those memories. I'd like to try to capture them." Michael's heart swelled with admiration. "I'll find you everything you need," he said eagerly. Over the next few days, he filled their apartment with canvases, paints, and brushes, guiding Clara's hands as she experimented. She laughed as her first attempts turned into colorful but chaotic streaks, and Michael marveled at her determination. "This one is for you," she said one afternoon, showing him a canvas filled with soft hues of blue and gold. "It's how I imagine you look when you smile." Michael stared at the painting, his throat tight. "It's perfect," he said, pulling her into a tender embrace. The act of painting became a new chapter for Clara, a way to merge her past with her present. And as she created, Michael felt himself learning to let go of the what-ifs that had once consumed him. Their love, no longer burdened by unmet expectations, flourished in the quiet moments, the sound of brushes on canvas, the gentle hum of music in the background, and the unspoken understanding that they had found their way back to each other. For the first time in years, Michael wasn't thinking about what he could do to change Clara's world. Instead, he was simply grateful to be part of it. Winter turned to spring, and Clara's life seemed to blossom along with the world around her. Painting became her solace, a way to capture not just the colors she remembered but the emotions tied to them. For Michael, watching her create was a revelation. Each brushstroke seemed to speak of her resilience, her depth, and her unshakable joy in the present. Still, a quiet tension remained, a weight they both felt but seldom acknowledged. Clara had moved forward, content in her decision to stop chasing treatments. But Michael occasionally caught himself wondering, had they truly closed the door on possibility? One day, as they strolled through the park, Clara paused. "What's wrong?" Michael asked, sensing her hesitation. She tilted her head, listening to the birds chirping high in the trees. "I've been thinking about something Dr. Marks said," she admitted. Michael slowed his pace, his heart tightening. "What did she say?" She asked me if I thought you could ever truly accept me as I am, Clara replied, her voice soft. And I told her I thought you could. But sometimes, I wonder if you're still holding on to that part of you that wants more for me. More than I want for myself. Michael stopped walking, turning to face her. Clara, I've let go of the treatments. I promised you I would, and I meant it. I know, she said, her fingers brushing his arm. But letting go isn't the same as being at peace with it. Her words lingered in the air, striking a chord deep within him. Michael realized she was right. Though he had honored his promise, a part of him still wrestled with the idea that he had failed her by not pursuing every possible option. What are you trying to say? He asked cautiously. Clara's face softened. I'm trying to say that I love you, Michael. But I need to know if you're truly happy with me as I am, not just because you're trying to prove something to yourself, but because you found peace in what we have. That night, Michael sat alone in their living room, her words replaying in his mind. He thought of the man he had been when he first met her, driven, determined, incapable of accepting limits. And then he thought of the man he was now, a man who had grown to love her not for what she could be, but for who she already was. The realization hit him like a wave. I am happy, he thought. I don't need anything else. The next morning, as Clara worked on a new painting, Michael approached her quietly. Clara, he said, his voice steady, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. She paused, her brush hovering over the canvas. And you're right, he admitted. I wasn't fully at peace. But I am now. I don't care if you never see again, because I see you. And I love you exactly as you are. Clara turned to him, her unseeing eyes filled with emotion. Do you really mean that? I do, he said, his voice firm. You've taught me more about life and love than I ever thought possible. And I don't want to waste another moment wishing for something we don't need. A tear slipped down Clara's cheek as she reached for him, her arms wrapping around his neck. Thank you, she whispered. For finally letting me be enough. From that moment, the last lingering doubt between them dissolved. Their love, unburdened by expectation, became lighter, freer. Michael threw himself into their shared adventures, accompanying Clara to art exhibits, traveling to new places, and creating a life built on connection rather than ambition. And Clara, for the first time, felt wholly seen, not as someone who needed fixing, but as someone who was already whole. The months that followed were a season of renewal. With the weight of expectations lifted, Clara and Michael built a life centered on joy and discovery. They traveled to places that stimulated Clara's senses, fragrant gardens in Japan, bustling marketplaces in Istanbul, the serene fjords of Norway where the wind carried the smell of salt and pine. Michael made a habit of describing each setting to her in detail, but Clara often stopped him, laughing. You don't have to paint me a picture, Michael, she'd say. Just hold my hand and let me feel it. She no longer felt the burden of being a project, and Michael found a quiet peace in simply being present with her. He stopped chasing solutions and started savoring moments. Together, they learned to slow down, letting life unfold as it would. One evening, in a quiet seaside village in Italy, Clara and Michael attended a private cello recital. The music filled the candlelit room, its rich, haunting tones weaving a story of longing and hope. Clara leaned into Michael's side, her fingers intertwined with his. It's beautiful, she whispered. Michael kissed the top of her head. Not as beautiful as you. She smiled but stayed silent for a moment, letting the music wash over her. When it ended, the room erupted in applause. Clara turned to Michael, her face serene. This is what I've always wanted, she said softly. Michael tilted his head. What do you mean? To be here, now. To feel the music, the warmth of your hand in mine, the breeze from the sea. It's enough. More than enough. Michael's chest tightened, her words resonating deeply. He had spent so long trying to give her what he thought she needed, only to discover that everything they had now, this simplicity, this togetherness, was what truly mattered. The following morning, they walked along the rocky shoreline as the waves lapped at their feet. Michael described the sunrise as it painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I wish you could see this," he said quietly. Clara stopped, her hand finding his cheek. "Michael," she said, her voice firm but kind, "you keep saying that. But don't you see? I don't need to see the sunrise. I have everything I need right here." Her words settled over him like a balm. For the first time, he truly understood. Clara didn't see the world as he did, but she experienced it just as deeply, through touch, sound, and emotion. And she had no regrets. That night, back at their rented villa, Clara brought out a canvas she had been working on in secret. She handed it to Michael, who gasped when he saw it. The painting was abstract, a swirl of warm colors, gold, orange, and blue, blending into one another. It reminded him of the sunrises he had described to her so often. "This is how I imagine it," Clara said softly. Michael's throat tightened as he studied the painting, the love and thoughtfulness in every stroke. "It's perfect," he said, pulling her into an embrace. "Just like you." As the days turned into weeks, Michael and Clara continued their journey, their bond growing stronger with each shared experience. They stopped worrying about what the future might hold and focused instead on the beauty of the present. It wasn't the life Michael had envisioned when he first met Clara, but it was better in every way. Because, for the first time, he saw her fully, not as someone who needed fixing, but as someone who had already taught him the most important lesson of all. True love doesn't seek to change, it simply seeks to embrace. A year had passed since Michael and Clara had stopped chasing the idea of perfection. Their life together had become a patchwork of memories, moments filled with laughter, tenderness, and the quiet joy of simply being present. On a warm summer evening, they returned to the park where they had once faced their greatest questions about love and acceptance. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine, and the distant hum of cicadas provided a soothing backdrop. Clara sat on the bench, her hands resting in her lap, her face turned toward the setting sun. Though she couldn't see the sky painted in hues of amber and violet, she could feel its warmth on her skin. Michael stood nearby, watching her with quiet reverence. He'd stopped trying to describe every detail, knowing that Clara preferred to experience things her own way. "Are you happy?" he asked, breaking the silence. She turned toward him, her smile soft but certain. "I've never been happier," she said. "And you?" Michael sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "Happier than I ever thought I could be." Clara's lips curved upward as she leaned into him. "It's funny," she mused. "When I think about how we started, I never imagined we'd end up here. But I wouldn't change a single moment." "Not even the tough ones?" Michael teased, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Especially not the tough ones," Clara replied. "They brought us here. They taught us how to love each other the way we needed, not the way we thought we should." Michael kissed her forehead, his heart full. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to prove his love through grand gestures or impossible fixes. Clara had taught him that love wasn't about changing someone, it was about seeing them for who they were and embracing every part of them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat in silence, the world around them quiet and still. And in that moment, they knew they had everything they needed. Goodbye, my fellow dreamers. As this story comes to a close, I want to thank you, dear readers, for journeying with Clara and Michael through their trials and triumphs. Their love story reminds us that perfection isn't what makes love extraordinary, it's the flaws, the challenges, and the willingness to grow together that truly make it beautiful. May we all find a love that sees us as we are and cherishes us for it. Until the next story, thank you for reading, and may your own lives be filled with wonder, growth, and unshakable love. Goodbye for now, and take care.